The morning Isobel Crane became a wife, it rained. Not the soft, romantic kind of rain that novelists like to write about. The kind that blurred carriage windows and made everything look like a watercolor. This was November rain. Hard and practical. The sort that soaked through wool and left a person cold in ways that had nothing to do with the weather. She stood at the altar of St. Edmund's Church in Harwick, holding a small bouquet of white roses that were already beginning to curl at the edges, and she thought, this is the arrangement. Not the flowers, all of it. The dress, the church, the man standing beside her whose name she had known for exactly 11 weeks. His name was Callum Ashworth. He was 31 years old. He owned the largest agricultural estate in the county of Dunmore, a fact her father had mentioned no fewer than 6 times during the weeks of negotiation that she had not been invited to attend. He had dark hair, a precise manner of speaking, and a handshake. She had noticed this at their first meeting when they'd been introduced in her father's drawing room like 2 parties at a business conference. That was firm without being warm. He was not unkind. She had been watching for unkindness, braced for it the way you braced for a door that was known to swing hard. And she had not found it. What she found instead was something she hadn't thought to prepare for. Indifference. The estate was called Ashworth Hall, though most of the county simply called it the Hall, as though there were no other hall worth distinguishing. It sat at the end of a long graveled drive, 4 stories of gray stone, its windows overlooking 30 acres of farmland to the east, and a stretch of woodland to the west that turned amber in October and bare by the time Isobel arrived. She stood in the entrance hall on the evening of their wedding, and thought it was the most beautiful and most silent place she had ever been. The housekeeper, Mrs. Stortle, Briggs, showed her the house with the efficient warmth of someone who had been briefed that the new wife was to be made comfortable but not coddled. The cook's name was Alice. The groundskeeper answered to Mr. Hadley. There were 12 rooms in the main wing, 4 in the east. The library was the second door on the left past the staircase, and dinner was served at 7:30. Mr. Ashworth takes his breakfast alone, Mrs. Briggs said as they reached the upper hall. He has done so for many years. He finds it helps him organize his thoughts before the workday. Isobel nodded as though this were a perfectly ordinary thing to say about a man to his wife on the night of their wedding. She did not see Callum again that evening until 7:30, when they sat across from each other at a dining table that had been designed, she suspected, for 14 people. He asked whether the room arrangements were satisfactory. She said they were. He mentioned that he had a meeting with the land agent the following morning and might be occupied until the afternoon. She said that was quite all right. He thanked her for the grace with which she had conducted herself during the ceremony. The word grace landed somewhere in her chest and sat there, not warming her, exactly, but not nothing either. That was November. By January she had learned the shape of her days. Callum was not a cruel man. She kept returning to this. The way you kept running your tongue over a tooth you weren't sure about. Checking. He did not raise his voice. He did not belittle her at table. When she offered an opinion at dinner, he listened with what appeared to be genuine attention before he responded, which was more than could be said for most men of his acquaintance. He paid the household accounts without complaint. He brought her a volume of poetry from his travels to Edinburgh in December, Keats, which she loved, and left it on her dressing table with a note that said simply, "Thought you might enjoy this." She had held the note for a long time. But there were other things. He never asked her what she thought of the estate, though she had thoughts about it daily. The east kitchen garden was badly managed. The drainage in the lower pasture was directing water toward the tenant cottages, and the household library had 3 identical copies of Blackstone's commentaries, and not a single work of fiction written after 1820. He met with Mr. Hadley every Tuesday morning and made decisions about the land she lived on without mentioning them to her until they had already been made. When his solicitor visited from London in February, Callum introduced her as my wife Isobel, not Isobel, whom you must meet, or my wife, who has some thoughts about the matter. Just my wife Isobel, as though the name and the role were the same thing. In March, she overheard him in the study. She had not meant to listen. She had come down the hall to ask Mrs. Bounds Briggs about the linen order, and she'd stopped at the sound of his voice, not unusual in itself, but then she heard a second voice, his old friend Arthur Pembridge, who visited every few months and stayed 2 days and drank Callum's brandy and talked about shooting. She had been about to knock when she heard Pembridge say her name. Isobel she seems very quiet. There was a pause. The fire crackled. She is, Callum said. Good match, though. Your father and hers were close. It was sensible, Callum said. The land borders align. Her family's name is solid. She's... Another pause, and she found she had stopped breathing. She manages the household efficiently. She doesn't interfere with the work. High praise, Pembridge said, with a laugh that she could not read. I didn't mean it that way. Didn't you? She walked back down the hall without knocking. She did not ask Mrs. Briggs about the linen. She went to the garden instead and stood among the bare rose canes until the cold of the stones came up through her boots, and she thought, she manages the household efficiently. She doesn't interfere. Not a wife. A good arrangement. She did not cry about it. This was something she noticed about herself later. That she did not cry about the things that should have made her cry in those first months. She had always been this way. Her mother, who had died when Isobel was 16, used to say that she processed things the way rivers processed winter, quietly and underground, and only visible again in the spring. What she did instead of crying was work. She started with the kitchen garden. She spoke to Alice about the herb beds first, then went to the gardener, a young man named Daniel who had only been in the post 2 years and was, she suspected, somewhat relieved to have someone ask him what he thought. Together they redrew the layout of the beds on paper first, then in practice, turning the wasted western corner into a proper cutting garden that would serve the house through summer. It took 3 weeks, and it was the most purposeful she had felt since arriving at the hall. Then she turned to the east cottages. The tenant farmer at the third cottage, a widower named Greaves, who had 2 daughters under 10, had a leak in the roof that had been reported to the land agent in autumn, and had apparently dissolved somewhere in the chain of correspondence between then and February. Isobel went to see it herself. She stood in the kitchen and looked at the dark water stain spreading across the ceiling above the fireplace, and felt something move through her that was close to anger, though she was careful not to call it that. She went to Callum that evening before dinner. The Greaves roof, she said. He looked up from his correspondence. What about it? It's been leaking since October. The land agent has a letter about it. Nothing has been done. He was quiet for a moment in the particular way he had, not dismissive, but considering, which she had learned to distinguish. I'll speak to Hadley. I've already arranged for a carpenter. He can be there Thursday. Another pause. Longer this time. You arranged it. There are 2 small children in that house, Callum. He looked at her for a moment, and she could not have said what was in the look. Then he said, "Thank you," and returned to his correspondence, and she was not certain whether the thanks was for what she'd done or for telling him. She told herself it didn't matter. She met Harriet Stowe at the Dunmore Assembly in April. Harriet was 34, a doctor's wife, and possessed of the particular quality, rare in Isobel's experience, of saying exactly what she meant without apology. They were introduced at the punch bowl by a mutual acquaintance and spent the rest of the evening in the corner by the window, speaking freely about books, about the poor state of the county road between Ashworth and the market town, and about the particular exhaustion of being a woman whose intelligence was considered a charming footnote rather than a primary fact. "You're quieter than I expected," Harriet said, as the evening wound down. "People speak well of you. What do they say? That you're gracious, capable." Harriet tilted her head. "Contained." Isobel looked at the far side of the room where Callum was speaking with a group of landowners. He said something and they laughed. He looked relaxed in a way he rarely looked at home. Lighter, somehow, as though the hall pressed down on him and the world outside lifted something from his shoulders. She watched him, and thought she understood, distantly, what it meant to see someone at their best in the place where they were not with you. "I suppose I am," she said. Harriet became her closest friend. The summer was easier. in the way summers generally were. The house opened up. The grounds demanded attention, and there was always something practical to occupy her. She learned the names of all 12 tenant families. She began accompanying Mr. Hadley on his quarterly rounds, which he accepted with the cautious approval of a man who had not expected to be shattered, but found the arrangement more useful than he'd anticipated. She wrote to her father every fortnight and to her old school friend Lydia Penrose, now Lydia Sefton, settled in Bath with 3 children and a husband who made her laugh, every week. Callum noticed the rounds. "Hadley tells me you've been riding out with him," he said one evening. "I have. He says you've made several observations about the drainage. The lower field is still directing runoff toward the cottages. The solution isn't complicated, but it requires committing to the work in late summer rather than waiting for the problem to arrive in autumn." Callum was quiet. This was becoming familiar to her. The silences that were not hostile, but were not quite open either. Spaces in which she couldn't always tell whether he was thinking or simply waiting for her to finish. "You have been busy," he said finally. "The land is mine too," she said, in some sense. She hadn't meant it to land the way it did. But she watched him hear it, and she did not apologize for it. In September, a letter arrived from her father. It was not the letter itself that undone her. Her father wrote often, fond and a little scattered, full of news from the village and careful questions about the Hall and how she was finding married life. It was the other letter, the one she found folded inside it, tucked into the back of the envelope as though it had slipped there by accident. Except it hadn't. It was in her father's handwriting, but older. The ink faded to a brown she recognized from his older documents. The paper different, and the date at the top was June 1869, 8 months before her wedding. For Isobel, when she is settled enough to read this without it frightening her. She sat down on the window seat in the upper hall and read it there, in the thin afternoon light. Her father had known, he wrote, that she would not love the arrangement. He had known it the way he had known everything about her since she was small. Not because he was certain he was right, but because he had watched her whole life and understood that her kind of loving was particular, not quick, not easy, not available to the merely decent or the practical or the sensible. He had made the match because he believed Callum was a man who could be reached. Not broken open. That wasn't what she needed, and he knew it. But reached. He had written to a friend who knew the Ashworth family, and what he had learned was this, that Callum was not cold because he was unfeeling, but because he had learned, somewhere in the particular misery of his own parents' marriage, that feeling was not safe, that the people who loved openly in that house paid a price for it, and that the price was too high. I believe, her father had written, that you have what it takes to outlast that lesson. I don't ask you to fix him. I only ask you to stay long enough to let him discover whether he wants to be reached. You are, my love, the most patient and the most formidable woman I know. You get that from your mother, who was both of those things to a degree I could never adequately name. She made me better than I would have been. I hope, in your own time, you find that you have done the same." The letter was unsigned. He had simply run out of room on the page, she thought, or perhaps he had felt that his name was unnecessary. She already knew whose it was. She sat there for a long time. She did not show it to Callum. But something shifted in her after that. Not a softening, exactly, and not the kind of forgiveness that required an accounting. Something quieter. She began to look at him differently, the way you looked at a landscape once someone had shown you what it had looked like before. She noticed things she had not let herself notice, the way he stood at the window in the early mornings. She had seen him once through the library door, before the household stirred, just standing and looking out at the east field as though it were a problem he was trying to solve. The way he spoke to the youngest of the Greaves children when he rode past, briefly, but kindly, in the particular tone adults use when they have not forgotten what it is to be small. The way he had placed the Keats on her dressing table and not mentioned it again, as though he'd needed to make the gesture without having to be thanked for it. She thought about the house he had grown up in. She thought about the lesson he had learned there. Winter arrived the way it always did at the Hall, all at once and with authority. By December, the lower grounds were too wet to ride. The mornings began in darkness, and the household contracted into itself, the staff moving between the kitchen and the main rooms with the practiced efficiency of people who had weathered this before. It was in December that Callum came to find her. She was in the library she had quietly been reshaping over the past months, adding novels and histories and 2 volumes of contemporary poetry to the shelves, displacing 1 copy of Blackstone's commentaries to the study where it more properly belonged. He knocked, which she had learned was his way, and she looked up. "May I?" he said. She gestured to the chair across from her. He sat, but did not immediately speak, which was also his way. She waited. "Hadley gave me the end-of-year accounts," he said finally. "Yes. The east cottages, the kitchen garden, the drainage work in the lower field." He was looking at the book in her lap, not at her. "The cost isn't the issue. The cost is. It's less than I'd expected, actually. But Hadley tells me that most of it was your doing. The arranging. The overseeing. The arranging. The overseeing." A pause. "I didn't know. You didn't ask," she said. He looked up at that. She met his eyes steadily because she had been meeting things steadily for 14 months, and she was not going to stop now. "No," he said. "I didn't. You thought I was managing the household. I did. I was managing your land." Another silence. Longer than the usual ones. "I owe you an accounting," he said. "You owe me nothing," she said. "This is my home. The people on this land are my people as much as yours. I did it because it needed doing." He looked at her the way he had looked at her once before, that time over the Greaves roof. And again she couldn't quite read what was in it. But this time he didn't return to anything. He stayed. "I told Pembridge last spring," he said, "that you didn't interfere with the work." Her hands were still on the book in her lap. "I heard," she said. He absorbed this in silence. She could see something moving behind his face. Not performed emotion, but the actual effort of a man who had learned not to show it and was trying, now, to unlearn that. "I was wrong," he said. "About what I said. And about what I said, and about what I meant by it." She looked at him. The fire snapped. "I know," she said. It was not resolved in an evening. She had known it wouldn't be. Her father's letter had said outlast the lesson, not erase it, and she was practical enough to understand the difference. There were still mornings when he was distant in the particular way that had nothing to do with her, and everything to do with whatever he was carrying from before she knew him. There were still dinners where the conversation did not come easily. There were still moments when she felt the old temptation to simply become smaller, to arrange herself around his silences so as not to cause friction. But she didn't. In January, he asked her to attend the quarterly meeting with Hadley, not because it would be useful, he said, though it clearly would be, because he thought she should be there. In February, he came to her in the kitchen garden. She was planting the spring beds with Daniel, both of them crouched in the cold with a paper plan spread across a wooden crate. And he stood there for a moment and said, "What are you putting here?" And she showed him. And he listened. Not in the polite, surface-level way he had listened in the early months, but with the kind of attention that was reaching for something, that wanted to understand. In March, they rode out together to the lower field. She showed him the drainage correction, the redirected channel, the reinforced bank, the 2 tenant cottages on the far edge that no longer took water in heavy rain. He looked at it for a long time without speaking. "You did this in September," he said, "late August mostly, before winter. That was the point." He turned to look at her, and she realized with the particular clarity of someone who had been paying close attention for 16 months, that this was the face he had when something reached him. Not the managed expression, the real one. "I should have been here for this," he said. "You are now," she said. There was a gathering at the Dunmore Assembly Rooms in late April, the county spring dinner, an event she had attended twice already and found more bearable than the autumn one, partly because the room was less cold, and partly because Harriet was always there. This time, Callum came to find her midway through the evening, which he had not done before. He had always remained in his orbit of landowners and old acquaintances, and she had remained in hers, and they had met at the carriage at the end of the night with the polite exhaustion of two people who had performed their separate social duties. This time he crossed the floor to her. She saw him coming through the crowd. She was standing with Harriet and Harriet's husband, Dr. Stowe, who was a kind man and asked good questions. And she watched him navigate the room with the precise efficiency he brought to everything, until he reached her and said, "Mrs. Ashworth, may I steal you for a moment?" Harriet's expression, to her credit, revealed almost nothing. He walked her to the far end of the room, near the tall windows that looked out over the market square, and then he stopped and said, with a directness that she recognized as something it had cost him, "I should like to change some things." She waited. "In how I—" He paused. "In how it has been. Between us." "All right," she said. "I don't know," he said, "that I am particularly good at this." "No," she said. "But I didn't need you to be good at it. I only needed you to try." He looked at her. Outside, the spring evening was moving into full dark, and the lights of the assembly room were warm against the glass. "You have been—" He started and stopped. Tried again. "I have not given you what you were owed." "You have given me a home," she said. "I made the rest." "Yes," he said. "I made the rest." "Yes," he said. "You did." She thought of her father's letter. The most patient and the most formidable. She thought of the 14 months she had spent in that house, building something real in the space between them. Not because she had expected him to meet her halfway, but because she had decided, sometime in the long winter of her first year, that the land was worth tending, and so was the man who didn't yet know how to ask her to. She took his arm. Not because he had earned it in any accounting book sense. Because she had chosen him, eventually and with her eyes open, the way you chose the things that were worth the work. They walked back into the light.